Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. I am Dr. Sarvat Rasool and our today's session is again on Joseph Andrews. In this session we would start book 2, that is part 2 of Joseph Andrews the novel, and since this is a long enough book, so we would cover chapters 1 to 9 in this session. We would look at the story, text, and we would do some critical analysis of important parts. Before I go into the details of today's session, I would like to share a review of the previous session. In the previous session, we covered book 1 of the novel Joseph Andrews, and that was from chapter 11 onwards. Headings of these chapters with reference to what they project about these chapters were discussed, important summary points, and then discussion related to those points was established. Also important parts of text with reference to the important themes that Fielding has talked about and the development of characters, we had some aspects to discuss. As far as today's session is concerned, in the current session we are going to start book 2. Well, book 2 has 17 chapters, however it is not possible to cover all the chapters in this session. So in this session we will cover first 9 chapters of the novel Joseph Andrews, book 2. Again, we would follow the same format. We would look at the headings of these chapters that provide some insights into what the chapters are about. We would discuss important summary points. Going through the text, we would look at important critical analysis points, and we would have some discussion on important issues related to the text. Again, I would read some important parts of the text, and with reference to the themes, development of characters, plot and structure, as well as Fielding's role as a writer, that is his work as a moralist, and his art of characterization would be discussed with reference to certain examples from the text that I would share with you through the session. So, starting with book 2, chapter 1, here is the heading of chapter 1 of this book. A very precise, very brief heading that says of deviance in authors. Thus, Fielding here projects and provides us what kind of discussion is made in this chapter. Even before reading the chapter, we know what the chapter is going to be about. And here I am going to share the opening text of book 2, chapter 1 with you. Well, the text runs as follows. There are certain mysteries or secrets in all trades, from the highest to the lowest, from that of prime ministering to this of authoring, which are seldom discovered unless to members of the same calling. Among those used by us gentlemen of the letter occupation, I take this of dividing our works into books and chapters to be none of the least considerable. So, what you can notice as a reader is that at the very outset of the second book, and in fact at the very outset of chapter 1 of this book, the author, that is Fielding, has clearly mentioned some details that justify his division of work into books and chapters. And he claims that all the trades, all the kind of work that people do, those who are involved in a particular kind of work, only they know about the secrets of that particular trade, and they know the ways of handling that. As far as authors are concerned, the division of works into books and into chapters is of considerable importance, according to him, for the authors. On this slide, opening text of book 2, chapter 1 continues, and I would read it for you. Fielding says, "But in reality the case is otherwise, and in this as well as all other instances we consult the advantage of our reader, not our own, and indeed many notable uses arise to him from this method. For first, those little spaces between our chapters may be looked upon as an inn or resting place where he may stop and take a glass or any other refreshment as it pleases him." Now, as an author, Fielding is justifying his use of deviance into books and chapters. We need to consider that novel, as Fielding wrote, Joseph Andrews, was at a stage of its initial development. No specific pattern for writing novel had yet been established, and the norms of the genre were yet to be settled. In that context, to enable the reader, number one, to understand what he writes, and number two, why he writes in that particular way or on that particular format, Fielding has to give justifications. And I would say very aptly and very appropriately, he has justified his use of headings, his use of chapters, as well as his use of books. And he says that spaces between these chapters, that is when one chapter finishes and the other chapter starts, it provides a pause. That pause or that space can be used by a reader to take a breath, to relax for a while. And he compares it with traveling. By using the metaphor of traveling, basically, he enables the reader understand that while somebody would be traveling on the road, the inns or the resting places that are provided on the road, they make the journey easy, because the traveler can stop there for a while, can refresh himself or herself, and can have a glass of drink, etc. Same is the case with reading. On the journey of reading, a reader can take a pause, can rest for a while, and can refresh himself or herself for the upcoming miles of the journey by taking a pause or a stop at the end of any chapter. Fielding continues the text by saying, "Nay, our fine readers will perhaps be scarce able to travel farther than through one of them in a day. As to those vacant pages which are placed between our books, they are to be regarded as those stages where in long journeys the traveller stays some time to repose himself and consider of what he hath seen in the parts he hath already passed through. A consideration which I take the liberty to recommend a little to the reader, for however swift his capacity may be, I would not advise him to travel through these pages too fast. For if he doth," now please notice the use of Old English, if he doth instead of does, "he may probably miss the seeing some curious productions of nature which will be observed by the slower and more accurate reader. A volume without any such places of rest resembles the opening of wilds or seas, which tries the eye and fatigues the spirit when entered upon." So you can notice that Fielding in detail extends the same metaphor of journey, and what he says is that there are some vacant pages, there are some empty pages in between the chapters and in between the books, and he says that they can be compared to those resting places in a journey where a traveler would stop for a while and would look back at what he or she has traveled so far. Fielding also makes a suggestion here as a writer. He invites the reader to read the text not very swiftly, not very speedily, rather with controlled and more accurate speed. He asks the reader to read it on a slower pace so that the reader can understand and absorb as much as possible. And again, he compares it with a traveler who, if swiftly passes through the road or through the area, would not be able to notice minute details of the beauty of nature. But if the traveler would go on a slower pace, he or she would be able to notice each and every minute detail of the beauty of nature. Well, commenting on Book 2, Chapter 1, I would say that at the start of this book, Fielding justifies as an author his practice of dividing literary works into books and chapters. And he has very rightly, as I have earlier said, compared the chapters of a book to the stages of a physical journey, with the white spaces between them standing for inns and resting places. And at the ends of chapters, Fielding suggests the reader should pause to consider what he has read, just as a traveler considers the curious productions of nature. Here we need to understand Fielding's viewpoint as an author. He wants not only the reader to read the novel as a source of pleasure, but also because he is a moralist and because he has a purpose for writing this novel, that is to convey some ideas or some main themes to the reader. So he wants the reader to pause after every small part that is read, and he wants the reader to think about that and to reflect upon that. According to him, the contents prefixed to every chapter are parallel to the inscriptions over the gates of inns, including what entertainment the traveler can expect to have there. Now he's talking about the inscriptions over the gates in comparison with the headings that he has given at the very top of each of the chapters. And as by reading the inscription that is written at the gate of an inn or a hotel or a resting place, we come to know what is offered there. In the same way, these headings, as we have been looking at those so far throughout book 1 as well, they provide us some clues for what is available within the chapter. Fielding also goes on to claim Homer as a precedent in dividing a literary work into books. To support his claims, he also gives examples of Virgil and Milton, who divided their works in books and chapters. With this, we move on to book 2, chapter 2, and we look at the heading of chapter 2. The heading runs as a surprising instance of Mr. Adams's short memory with the unfortunate consequences which it brought on Joseph. So even before reading the chapter, we are given some clues. It is indicated that because of his short memory, Parson Adams would create some funny situations, and he would also create some unfortunate consequences of his short memory's impact that would lead towards some impact on Joseph. Again, here I would share with you the opening text of book 2, chapter 2, that goes as follows. Mr. Adams and Mr. Joseph were now ready to depart different ways, when an accident determined the former to return with his friend, which Taus, Barnabas and the bookseller had not been able to do. This accident was that those sermons which the parson was travelling to London to publish were, O my good reader, left behind. What he had mistaken for them in the saddlebags being no other than 3 shirts, a pair of shoes and some other necessaries, which Mrs. Adams, who thought her husband would want shirts more than sermons on his journey, had carefully provided him. So, the part of text that I have shared clearly tells the instance of forgetfulness of Parson Adams, that the very sermons that he wanted to get published and that he wanted to sell, they were left back home. Partially Parson Adams' own forgetfulness and partially Mrs. Adams' choice or her preference or her thought that Adams would need shirts and other necessities more than those sermons on the way. Because of these 2 reasons, the sermons were not placed in his saddlebag and they are left behind. Now, this part of the chapter, I am again going to share some text that tells you how this secret was revealed. Fielding writes, this discovery was now luckily owing to the presence of Joseph at the opening of the saddlebags, who, having heard his friend say he carried with him 9 volumes of sermons, and not being of that sect of philosophers who can reduce all the matter of the world into a nutshell, seeing there was no room for them in the bags where the parson had said they were deposited, had the curiosity to cry out, "Bless me, sir, where are your sermons?" The parson answered, There, child, there they are, under my shirts." Now it happened that he had taken forth his last shirt, and the vehicle remained visibly empty. "Sure, sir," says Joseph, "there's nothing in the bags." Upon which Adams, starting and testifying some surprise, cried, "Hey, fee upon it, they are not here sure enough. They are certainly left behind." Well, this part of the text clearly mentions a few things. Number 1, it reveals the truth to the reader, that the reality to the reader that the sermons are left behind. It also sheds some light on the rationality of Joseph, who, by looking at the size of the bag, even without checking in it, can understand that 9 thick volumes of sermons cannot be placed in a small bag. Besides, the bag seems to be empty as it is looked at. Visibly, it shows there is nothing in it. This incident also throws some light on the simplicity of Parson Adams, who is cocksure that the sermons are in the bag, and when Joseph points out that there is nothing in the bag, he, in utter surprise, he says that they are not here sure enough. They are certainly left behind. Well, dear students, another insight that these chapters, especially chapter 2, provides regarding Parson Adams' character is that Parson Adams is very optimistic and is a positive-minded person by nature. When he comes to know that he has, in fact, left his manuscript sermons back home, he, looking on the bright side of it, interprets the disappointment as a providence intended for his good. So he not only is a true believer, but also he looks at things in a positive way and is not much disturbed by these small things that may be interpreted negatively by somebody else. There are some other happenings in this chapter, and here I have provided a few important points of further happenings in this chapter. When the inn bill comes where they have stayed, Mr. Adams has only a shilling to spare, and he would have been even worse off if a servant belonging to the coach and six had not lent him a guinea. He and Joseph together leave for the country seat of the Booby family and planning to take turns riding the horse. So now they decide to take a horse and they would ride on it, taking turns. While Mr. Adams starts on foot, however, the hostler detains Joseph at the inn, demanding payment for the horse's board. Now, because the horse was also kept there, they have to pay for that, and Joseph is detained there. He is stopped there. He is not allowed to move with Adams. Joseph is not ready to pay with the gold piece that belonged to Fanny, so it leads to a dispute. Now, since neither Adams nor Joseph have any money with them, the only valuable that Joseph has is a small piece of gold that we have talked about when we were discussing different chapters of book 1. This small piece of gold, since it belongs to Fanny, it is very, very dear to Joseph, and he is not ready to give it as a price for the payment of horse's board. Meanwhile, Mr. Adams has forgotten all about Joseph during a meditation on SHLS, and after a time he remembers his companion and gradually begins to wonder why he has not joined him. Now that you know that Parson Adams is very, very forgetful, so soon he forgets that Joseph was supposed to join him, and while he's thinking about his own scholarly matters, he completely forgets this issue. However, when he remembers that, he recalls that, he starts wondering and worrying why Joseph has not joined him. He sits down and starts reading, and as Joseph still does not appear, he enters a nearby alehouse. With this, we move to chapter 3 of this book that has the heading that runs as follows: The opinion of two lawyers concerning the same gentleman with Mr. Adams's inquiry into the religion of his host. Again, the heading provides us some clues about what kind of discussion is going to be presented in the chapter that Fielding is just about to share as an author. Here are some important summary points from this chapter. In the alehouse, Mr. Adams overhears two travelers discussing Joseph's quandary. He resolves to return to the inn, and though he has no real plan for making the payment. A rainstorm prevents him, however, and he stays for a beer with the two travelers, who give him their separate opinions about a neighboring gentleman landowner. Now, what are the two different kinds of opinions that these people give? One considers the gentleman a cruel tyrant and an arbitrary justice of the peace, whereas the other considers him reasonable and just. Of course, these are two juxtaposing opinions that are given by these two people. So, confused, Adams asks the host, who explains to him that the two travelers were opposing parties in a recent case, so none of them spoke a single word of truth. Meanwhile, a stagecoach arrives and Mrs. Slipslop comes there. She has paid for Adams's horse during a stopover at the inn. Later, Joseph arrives on the horse and he and Mr. Adams settle between them that the curate should continue the journey in the stagecoach while Joseph continues on the horseback. As now Mr. Adams and Mrs. Slipslop are together in the coach, they discuss the recent developments in the Booby family, since both of them belong to the Booby countryside, and genuinely and naturally they are interested in the affairs of Booby family. So they take this as an opportunity to discuss those. Slipslop tells him how Lady Booby has been acting like a mad woman, this is the word that he uses for her, since the departure of Joseph. Being good-natured, Adams, however, expresses his regret over all this, but Slipslop is not ready to accept this, and she believes that Lady Booby is worse than this. She also claims that Adams does not know anything about Lady Booby. With reference to Lady Booby's family, Mrs. Slipslop also makes some other claims. For example, she asserts that Sir Thomas would have been more generous to the poor in the parish if his wife had let him. So basically what we notice is that Slipslop is continuously talking against Lady Booby, that according to the moral standards in general would not suit a servant. Anyhow, there is an interruption by another lady in the carriage who is also traveling in the same carriage, and she informs her fellow passengers that yonder lives the unfortunate Leonora. And this leads the passengers back to the story of Leonora. If you remember, in book 1 there was a digression where Fielding shared the story of Leonora. Now, as a very cunning and very clever craftsman, Fielding, because he wants to add something more about the story of Leonora, so he creates actually here a way of inserting it here. And one of the characters in the carriage refers to a place while sitting in the carriage and says that is the place where unfortunate Leonora lives, and from there of course then people again are interested in the story, and we would listen to the story in of course the upcoming part. At the end of the previous chapter, that is chapter 3 of book 2, Fielding has prepared us that the next chapter would present the story of Leonora. So the heading of chapter 4 itself again reiterates that. The heading goes as The History of Leonora, or the Unfortunate Jilt. Here is Leonora, 18 years old, was the daughter of a rich gentleman of fortune and now lived with an aunt. This young but vain girl would attend each and every party of their public meeting and had singled out a younger gentleman, Horatio, from her many admirers at these gatherings. Now, who was Horatio? Horatio was a handsome and dignified young man who asked for her hand, and Leonora accepted. Everything was settled well. Even the wedding date was fixed and was now but a fortnight away. At this time, Horatio, who was a barrister, went off to the country sessions. Meanwhile, Leonora at home spied a coach passing by her window and declared, "Oh, I am in love with that equipage." Now, what is that? The person, the owner of the coach, who is named as Bellarmine. Bellarmine is the owner of the coach who lately arrived from Paris, so of course he is very fashionable and very attractive, and Leonora is very much attracted by the physical appearance of Bellarmine. As far as this gentleman is concerned, he came in all his French finery at an assembly held that evening and was immediately impressed by Leonora's perfect beauty. So concluding this, we can say that both of them are attracted towards each other. Leonora, who had earlier decided not to dance in Horatio's absence, now decided to dance with him as she was attracted towards him. The next afternoon, Bellarmine proposed to Leonora, and thoughts of Horatio pricked her conscience for a little while, but her aunt soon put a stop to those thoughts by saying, "I assure you there is not anything worth our regard besides money." So again, the theme of money-mindedness comes in, and also the theme of physical appearance versus the true virtue or reality is presented by Fielding. That evening, Leonora and Bellarmine were at dinner when suddenly Horatio came. He was shocked to see that Leonora treated him as if he was no more than a common acquaintance, while Bellarmine hummed an opera tune and strolled around the room. This led to a quarrel. The aunt entered then and appraised Horatio of the true state of affairs. Temporarily, the situation was controlled, but next morning when Leonora woke up, she received the news that Bellarmine had been mortally wounded by Horatio. While Leonora assumed various frantic poses of grief, her aunt prudently advised her to make up with Horatio. However, soon a letter arrived from Bellarmine that was nothing mortal about his wounds. Leonora's remorse immediately vanished, and she resolved to visit Bellarmine despite her aunt's advice. Adams, who is listening to the story at this point, comes to know that he has arrived at the inn. So his curiosity remains unsatisfied. He wants to know further details about the story of Leonora. Well, with this we move on to the heading of chapter 5, and the heading of chapter 5 says, "A dreadful quarrel which happened at the inn where the company dined, with its bloody consequences to Mr. Adams." Here are some important summary points from chapter 5 of book 2. Joseph is already at the inn sitting in the kitchen and is badly injured because of a heavy fall from Adam's eccentric horse. The hostess who is attending them is berated by her husband for wasting time on a mere footman. Parson Adam comments on this that he believes the devil has more humanity. This leads to a quarrel, sparking off a fist fight in which Adams lays out the host, then promptly receives from the hostess a panful of hog's blood in the face. Mrs. Slipslops enters at this time point and finds Adams dripping with blood. She thinks it is Adams' blood, so she holds the hostess because she thinks that it is done by the hostess, whose anguished cries bring the rest of the company into the room. So again, a very, very humorous episode is added here. Now, one of the two men who had earlier quarrelled over the character of the justice back in chapter 3 advises the host to recover damages against Adams. "I must speak the truth," he says, and offers his own distorted views as evidence. The host has no faith in the law, however, and turns on his wife for wasting his hog's puddings. Meanwhile, the other gentleman encourages Parson Adams to go to the court against the host. But Adams admits that it was he who struck the first blow. He is also shocked to hear the suggestion of this gentleman that Joseph, who is the only witness to this event, should lie in Adams' favor. Here on this slide we continue with the important points from chapter 5, book 2. The quarrel is finally settled and the coachman is anxious to be on his way. Mrs. Graveairs, however, refuses to admit a mere footman, that is Joseph, into the coach. This leads to, again, a very hot exchange between her and Mrs. Slipslop. However, this comes to an end by the arrival of Mrs. Graveairs' father, who takes his daughter away with him. Now that Mrs. Graveairs is gone, Once again in the coach, the women begin criticizing the character of Mrs. Graveairs. As far as Mrs. Slipslop is concerned, she entertains notions of playing the good Christian to Joseph and is suspiciously affectionate. To avoid any improper consequences, one of the ladies begs for the story of Leonora to be resumed. Now, after all the humorous and funny happenings, also the quarrels that take place at the inn during their stay, once again they resume the journey. As the journey is resumed, again Fielding creates a background in which the story of Leonora is to be resumed. Well, here is some text that I am quoting from this chapter, and actually this part of the text is a very clear-cut social commentary that gives us insights into the social setup. The text goes as follows. Everything being now adjusted, the company entered the coach, which was just on its departure, when one lady recollected she had left her fan, a second her gloves, a third a snuff box, and a fourth a smelling bottle behind her, to find all which occasioned some delay and much swearing to the coachman. As soon as the coach had left the inn, the women altogether fell to the character of Miss Graveairs, whom one of them declared she had suspected to be some low creature from the beginning of their journey, and another affirmed she had not even the looks of a gentlewoman. A third warranted she was no better than she should be, and turning to the lady who had related the story in the coach, said, "Did you ever hear, madam, anything so prudish as her remarks?" So basically what we can notice from the text is Fielding as a satirist here satirizes on the appearances and belief of people in appearances. He also satirizes the manners and mannerism, the so-called manners of the upper class and the snobbish attitude of the upper class people, where every woman in the coach remembers something that she has left behind, which of course causes a lot of delay for the journey to be resumed. However, once the journey starts, again everybody starts criticizing the character of Miss Graveairs. Again, Fielding as a satirist and as a moralist is pointing out how vanity leads towards people believing about themselves to be very good, whereas about others to be bad, and how people criticize others without any proof. They start blaming, and they would talk about their character. As I have said earlier, theme of appearance and reality is the main focus of this chapter. The arrogant behavior of the host is based on his false interpretation of appearance, as he thinks that Joseph does not merit any attention because he wears the uniform of a footman. Adams, who is in his usual rough state, is also scorned for this and is hated for the same reason. Condemning the host, Fielding once again proves his humanitarian and moralistic standpoint. Another theme that is projected through the chapter is that of virtue and vice. Again, in the hostess's care for Joseph, we can say that Betty may not be a model of perfection, but we admire her for her charity and even for her loyalty to her husband. What Fielding as a moralist wants to point out is that no human being can be perfect. However, a bigger proportion of, or a larger proportion of goodness is what makes a human being better than others. Here we also need to contrast the behavior of truthful Adams to that of the two gentlemen who are ready to falsify evidence to suit themselves, because they said that Adams has Joseph Andrews as the only witness to the event. So if Joseph falsifies and tells lies about his comments on what happened there, the situation could be turned in favor of Adams. However, Adams refuses to do that, and it also throws light on Adams' firm belief in true value of truthfulness and of of real virtue, because he does not agree to do that, and he accepts that he was the person who started the quarrel. He was the one who hit the first blow, so he would not go to the court. The next theme that is mentioned here is that of vanity, and it is in her vanity that Mrs. Slipslop engages in a hot exchange with Mrs. Greyvears. But later on, she is worried about the consequences when Greyvears leaves with her father. Now, Slipslop thinks about that she might have to face some consequences because of that. Well, discussing the role of this chapter, that is chapter 5, in terms of the development of plot and structure, I would say that chapter 5 provides an interlude in Fielding's long digression about Leonora. It is an insertion of scrappiness of real life placed midway in a polished and well-turned out tale. In a sense, chapter 4, 5 and 6 are a microcosm of Joseph Andrews, that is the novel itself. With this, we move to chapter 6 of this book, and the heading of this chapter runs as Conclusion of the Unfortunate Jilt. So again, at the outset, we are prepared what we are going to find in the chapter. Here, all this unfortunate jilt would be, Fielding would be winding it up for us. Here are important summary points from this chapter. Leonora's story is resumed in this chapter. Her too much attention to the wounded Bellarmine led towards some gossip amongst the ladies of the town. But when Bellarmine recovered from the injuries, he went to discuss the terms of his marriage to Leonora with her father. Her father was a callous man who looked at his children as rivals in the enjoyment of his own ruthlessly amassed fortune. The natural result of this was that when Bellarmine asked for dowry, the father refused. Again, the theme of money-mindedness and materialism comes in. The result of all this was that within a few days, Leonora received a letter from Bellarmine, who now had returned to Paris, and in this letter, it was told to her, she learned that he was not going to marry her. The narrator of the story tells that completely dejected and upset, Leonora retired to the house seen earlier from the coach. So, Fielding as an author creates a link between different parts of the story. The woman who is telling the story winds up the story by telling that today Horatio prospers. Remember, Horatio was left by Leonora because he was not that rich as was Bellarmine. But he is still single and never hears the name of Leonora without a sigh, which implies that he was still in love with Leonora. With this, the chapter comes to an end. So what we find is that by the end of this chapter, the digression, the long digression actually that was of the story of Leonora, is brought to an end by Fielding. Before we move on, there are some important discussion points with reference to this chapter that shed some light on plot development and themes. At first, the story of Leonora would appear to be an isolated narrative inserted in the main plot just as a filler or digression. However, if we look at it keenly, we come to know that its main concern is central to the novel Joseph Andrews, and it expresses the same theme of appearance versus reality. Fielding's main concern is what lies behind a person's clothes and appearance. And this is what he shows through the whole story of Leonora. Horatio, though living up to the dignity apparent in his own bearing, is deceived by the appearance and beauty of Leonora. On the other hand, Leonora manufactured all manner of passion on the strength of Bellarmine's French affectations. The kind of French finery that Bellarmine was displaying, the kind of manners and mannerism that are so-called manners of the upper class, he was exhibiting all that added to his appearance, and it attracted Leonora. The cause of this passion, which distorted her person into several shapes and her face into several lofts without any reason. If you remember at the very outset of the novel, when I was discussing the preface of the novel, I mentioned that for Fielding, affectation is the main theme of the novel, and according to him, vanity and hypocrisy are the two main sources of affectation. So here in this case, Leonora's vanity leads towards ridiculous, and she becomes a victim of ridicule. She has to face people's laughter, and this all is a result of vanity, that is one of the sources of affectation. Continuing with some discussion points from the same chapter, that is chapter 6 of book 2, I would like to talk about Fielding as a moralist. Well, while discussing Horatio, Fielding writes that he was made of sterner stuff, and like Adams had the ability to the heart of the matter with physical courage. Remember, whensoever Adams would be caught up in a situation where some physical courage or bravery is to be exhibited, you would never find Adams lagging behind. He would always be the first one to show that physical courage, and Fielding seems to admire that. In the case of Horatio, again we see that he attacks on Bellarmine, and again he is very much like Adams in exhibiting his physical courage. In this case, Fielding comments, the seat of valor is not in the continents, and it is only just that the cowardly Bellarmine should be a victim of the active virtue of Horatio. So, according to Fielding, when truly needed for active virtue and to support real virtue, if one has to exhibit physical valor, courage and power, that is appreciated by Fielding. Fielding as a moralist has presented the themes of affectation and self-interest throughout the chapter. Despite all the affectations of love, passion and devotion, Bellarmine's interest in Leonora was purely financial. But Leonora's father, who had the reputation of being a good parent, loved his gold better than his daughter. So Bellarmine, who had made all the claims of his passion for this young girl, finally refuses to marry her. Interestingly and ironically, it was only Horatio who eventually made money through it. And you would notice that what Fielding supports is that if somebody has the real good virtue, it would lead towards success. And we are also told here that though it was the memory of Leonora that mattered the most to him, despite the fact that he has made a lot of money and he's a rich man now, he still endears the memory of Leonora. My dear students, with this we move on to the headings of chapters 7, 8 and 9 of book 2 respectively, and then collectively we would share the details of important summary points, as well as we would do a critical analysis of these chapters. Chapter 7 has a heading that runs as follows. It's a very short chapter in which Parson Adams went a great way. Chapter 8 has a heading that runs, a notable dissertation by Mr. Abraham Adams, wherein that gentleman appears in a political light. Whereas the third chapter that I have combined with it, that is chapter 9, it has a heading in which the gentleman descants on bravery and heroic virtue till an unlucky accident puts an end to the discourse. So just by looking at the headings of these three chapters, we can see that they are interlinked, and that is why I have brought them together. And we also come to know what is going to happen in these chapters. So this is what happens through these chapters 7 to 9. The coach now catches up with Adams, who is so pleased at getting Joseph into the coach that he has quite forgotten to redeem the horse from the stable. Despite the efforts of the coach to overtake him, Adams goes fast enough to leave the coach behind. The result is very soon he misses his way. Again, this is an instance of Parson Adams' forgetfulness. If you remember, he already on the journey several times has exhibited his habit of forgetfulness. For instance, just in a chapter that we have been through in this book, we were told that while they were on the way, he simply forgot that Joseph Andrews was supposed to join him while he was detained at the inn for not being able to pay for horse's board. Now again, Parson Adams completely forgets that he has to keep the pace in such a way that he does not miss the coach and he's not separated from them. He, in his zeal, goes very fast. The natural result is that he's separated from the other people who are traveling on the coach, Joseph Andrews being one of them. Now the result is that very soon he misses his way, so he is completely lost. Resting on the summit of a hill, he starts reading his copy of the classic that he always carries with him, and he is shocked and frightened to hear a gunshot as he sits there. Soon he is into conversation with the sportsman there. At first suspicious of Adams' disheveled appearance, the sportsman starts to talk to him, complaining that the soldiers quartered nearby have killed all the game. If only they were as accurate with the enemy, the man complains. Then he launches into praise for a man who is willing to lay down his life for his country. So this this hunter man is actually complaining about that all the game or all the sport of hunting has been destroyed by, it has been badly affected by the soldiers. And then he starts launching some praise. He starts praising a man who is willing to lay down his life for his country. He praises soldiers for that. Adams rebukes his companion's swearing but appreciates his patriotism. Now this hunter man is in a habit of continually swearing, which Adams dislikes and points out. However, he is appreciative of his patriotic ideas. Here Adams starts relating how in various elections his vote and influence over his nephew, an alderman of a corporation, have been sought after by fickle politicians, culminating with Sir Thomas Booby, who, for all his apparent good intentions, failed like the others to reward Adams with the living he had promised him. Perhaps because Lady Booby did not think his clothes good enough for the gentry at her table. Now this nephew is dead. Adams no longer considers himself such a political wedge, but he has continued to put a dash or two of politics into his sermons, hoping that Sir Thomas might eventually procure an ordination for his 30-year-old son, in whom Adams has inculcated his own principles of serving God and country. Well, a very important thing about all this description that I would like to share with you is that Parson Adams is presented as a character who would be highly in favor of real virtue and would be against vanity. However, here we can notice the streak of vanity in the character of Adams himself, who is boasting about all his knowledge of politics and his contribution towards that. Now this gentleman launches forth on his theme of bravery once again, telling Adams that he has disinherited a nephew whom he believed to be dragging his feet with regard to active service. Adams advises a more forgiving attitude, and this inclination towards being more forgiving to people, actually here I would say that Adams serves as a mouthpiece of Fielding, who believes in this. Adams sees that the stagecoach is now 3 miles ahead of him, but the gentleman persuades him not to try and catch up with the coach so late in the evening and offers him accommodation at his own house. On their way there, the gentleman continues to praise bravery, but when they hear a woman shrieking for help, this same gentleman runs to the safety of his house, while Adams, snapping his fingers, makes for the fray and finds a woman being assaulted. Adams promptly cracks his crabsticks on the fellow's head, but the thick-skulled assailant manages to give Adams a drubbing before the parson finally lays him out with a solid clip to the chin. So solid indeed that Adams fears he has killed the man. The woman explains to Adams how she had been traveling to London and had fallen in with this man for company, only to find that his intentions went far beyond those of a mere traveling companion. Again, I would say that in this part of the novel Joseph Andrews, again Fielding has not missed the opportunity to throw some light on the main theme of appearance versus reality and that of affectation. And the man who is bragging about his own bravery and who gives long lectures on appreciating brave and courageous behavior, as soon as he hears the cry of a woman who is in some troublesome situation, he runs to his own house and he prefers his own safety. Again, true virtue is presented through the character of Parson Adams, who with all his physical valor and courage, he supports the woman in that situation, who tells, as she's rescued, tells Adams that she is basically traveling to London, and on her way she had taken that man only as a companion. Adams thanks Providence for sending him to the rescue in time, and if the fellow is indeed dead, Adams relies on the goodness of his intention to excuse him in the next world and on the woman's evidence to acquit him in this. However, you can notice that Parson Adams is worried about the man whom he has hit very strongly with the solid clip. So, apprehending that the man might have died, Adams thinks that because he did it with a good intention, God would forgive him in the next world. As far as this world is concerned, he believes that the woman whom he tried to help would like to tell the truth and would be an evidence to that he was actually not responsible for what happened. Well, there are some important discussion points with reference to this chapter. Adams may lose his way in the most short-sighted manner, but we already know that his innocence has a surer foundation of virtue than that suggested by the bluster of the sportsman. Both his virtue and his innocence are apparent in the account he gives of his unfortunate brushes with political matters, occasioned by the importance of his nephew. He stands by his word in all good faith, whatever the temptation, yet is consistently surprised that those he supports always fail to fulfill their promises to him. Here again we can notice that Fielding, as a moralist and as a satirist, he comments on the society, and he comments on the society, especially what happens in the political sphere with reference to the elite class people. Nevertheless, Adams, being a simple person, interprets the failings of such men as Sir Oliver Harty and Sir Thomas Booby in the most charitable light, and gives a justification in his innocence and with a touch of vanity. And he says that in the hope that if his son is ever of as much consequence in a public light as his father once was, he will use his talents as honestly, which means he would again support him. By so far as we have been through book 1 of the novel Joseph Andrews and some part of book 2 as well, you would have noticed that such names as Colonel Courtly and Esquire Fickle are part of Fielding's satire, and this account may well refer to Fielding's own experience when he broke his long-standing association with the Champion, that is the political newspaper that he was working with, and his opposition to Walpole. In their race for power, which they gained in February 1742, the opposition, the patriots, forgot their obligations to such allies as Fielding, who consequently broke with them despite his need for money. The sportsman's patriotic protestations of valor on behalf of his country proved to be as empty as the principles and promises of the actual so-called patriots. If you remember the introductory lecture on the novel Joseph Andrews, I made references to the patriots and to the Champion as well. If you do not remember, maybe you can go back and look at those details. Another important discussion point with reference to this chapter is that of the themes of affectation and vanity versus true and real virtue. In contrast to the rapid retreat of the sportsman, we are presented with Adams' example of bravery. Appearances have again proved to be deceptive. This man seemed to be very brave, however he did not prove to be in the situation where a woman needed help. In his mocking comments about the thickness of the ravisher's head, comments which extend to the commanders of armies and empires, Fielding is again discrediting those whom we traditionally regard as heroes, so that he can highlight the real heroism of Adams. This also provides some light, some insights into Fielding's concept of real heroism, because he presents Adams as the real hero who, regretting the death of this man whom he has hit to save the woman, thinks of his opponent, nonetheless says, but God's will be done. So again, his firm belief in God's will. Virtue, come what may, must always be put into practice according to Adams' code. And of course, Adams is a mouthpiece of Fielding here. Well, dear students, here is some text from chapter 9, book 2 that I would like to share with you. This text sheds light on Adams' character. Fielding writes, but Adams, who was no chicken and could bear a drubbing as well as any boxing champion in the universe, lay still only to watch his opportunity. And now, perceiving his antagonist to pant with his labors, he exerted his utmost force at once, and with such success that he overturned him and became his superior, when, fixing one of his knees in his breast, he cried out in an exulting voice, "It is my turn now." And after a few minutes' constant application, he gave him so dexterous a blow just under his chin that the fellow no longer retained any motion, and Adams began to fear he had struck him once too often, for he often asserted he should be concerned to have the blood of even the wicked upon him. The text continues, and here is the text of the last paragraph of this chapter, which again throws some light on Adams' character. Adams encouraged her for saying she had put her whole trust in Providence. Here her is Fanny. And told her, that is, told Fanny, he doubted not, but Providence had sent him to her deliverance to save her as a reward for that trust. He wished indeed he had not deprived the wicked wretch of life, but God's will be done, said he. He hoped the goodness of his intention would excuse him in the next world, and he trusted in her evidence to acquit him in this. He was then silent and began to consider with himself whether it would be proper to make his escape or to deliver himself into the hands of justice, which meditation ended, as the reader will see in the next chapter. So Fielding, as master of the art of writing, he closes the chapter in such a way that he generates curiosity in the reader to see the next chapter in order to find out what finally Parson Adams decided to do, whether to escape or to give himself into the hands of justice. With this, we come to the end of this session. Here is a list of references that I've used to create this session, and I have incorporated. Before I close the session, I would like to share a summary of today's session. Well, in today's session, we have covered part 1 or first half of book 2, which means we have covered from chapter 1 to 9. While covering these chapters, we looked at the headings of these chapters, as Fielding has rightly said, that these headings are just like inscriptions on the heads of inns that provide insights into what is available at those inns. In the same way, these headings provided us some pre-hand knowledge about those chapters before we went through those. Since it is not possible to read each and every word of the text and to share it here in the sessions, so important points from these chapters, the summary points, were shared with you, and some points of discussions were generated, and I tried to look at things in a critical light and discussed with you some important aspects of these chapters. Also, important parts of text with reference to the themes, development of characters, plot and structure were discussed by presenting selected parts of the text. I also threw some light on Fielding's work as a moralist, his work as a satirist, and his art of characterization. And for proving my points, I gave examples from the text of these chapters as well. With this, we come to the end of today's session. Thank you very much.